Thank you for joining the Alliance webinar today. People are coming on board. We'll give another minute and then we start. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining the AccessSpace Alliance webinar today. I'm going to have the panelists now online. To start sharing the video, please, so we can introduce you all. So I want to thank all the registered people and attendees today, and also the panelists today to join the webinar. We're going to be discussing going back to the moon, and there are different speakers today that will give us some background. Plus, we have a keynote speaker, which is going to come in about an hour. He couldn't make it at 2 o'clock, so it's going to come around 3 o'clock. I will start my first introductions basically right now. I'm going to share my screen with the introductions. I will ask the panelists to remove their video for now. And then I'm going to have Carlos, Andrew, Bob, and Peter one by one to do their presentation. I'll explain that now in my presentation, my introductions presentation, basically. Here we are. I hope everybody can hear me and see the screen with my presentation. Thank you for joining, everyone. So welcome to the AccessSpace Alliance webinar. This is the second series of webinars we are doing. They're not as often, they're not weekly as they used to be at the beginning of the year. We're now doing them once or twice a month, these webinars. So we're here to support the small satellite sector, in general, the space sector, basically, promoting companies and individuals that have an affiliation with space. The agenda today will be these introductions that I'm doing right now. We'll have 4 panelists at 10 minutes each presenting their activities on the moon, future moon activities, basically. A short panel discussion, maybe 5-10 minutes just between the panelists. We're going to have the keynote speaker coming on board around 3 o'clock local time. And then also Q&A session just after that. So bear with us during that time. I'll remind everyone, if you want to look at the AccessSpace Alliance, you can join us. Send me an email and look at also our website, www.access.space. So here's our panelists today. We have Carlos doing the presentation, first presentation from Carlos, then Andrew Aldrin. We're going to have Peter Eckart and Bob Brumley from Laser Light as well, and then our keynote from Javier Labao from ESA, the European Space Agency. We have about 188 registered people, individuals from 44 different countries. As you can see, a majority of the people are actually joining us from Europe. We have many as well from the Americas, the United States, and South America, and happy Thanksgiving to the Americans USA people, basically. I know that it's not the same time in Canada Thanksgiving, but happy Thanksgiving to the Americans joining us. And then we also have people from Asia as well as Middle East and Africa as well. Just to remind everyone, we had 16 different webinars up to the 16th of July this year. I will send everyone the slides, and you can actually log into YouTube channels to watch the previous webinars. We have very interesting subjects earlier this year. So you'll find most of the videos online on YouTube to watch freely. And this one will also be posted on YouTube. The recording will be put on YouTube in a couple of weeks. AccessSpace Alliance, I'm going to introduce you to AccessSpace Alliance. We have Betty, myself, and Christian, who are the founders and directors of the Alliance. That's us. Our intent and objective for the AccessSpace Alliance is to connect people, companies, and foster collaboration between companies and also institutions around the world. We're here to advise, share our experience, and also share the experience of the companies of the Alliance. We advocate and promote policies for the benefit of the sector. So we help, we try to help the sector basically to write papers or position papers to push particular policies. We promote the education and create awareness and opportunities in space. We also work with the universities and students and other research organizations as well. And we're here also to standardize, propose procedures and standards and interoperability of the technologies that we use in space, basically. We have nearly about, in fact, now about 90 organizations who have joined the Alliance. We will be issuing a request to members to actually join us formally over the next few weeks. And we have offices in the UK, in France, and in Germany as well. These are most of the companies that so far have requested to join our Alliance on this page. You don't have to actually read it or check if you're there or not, but I'll send you the slides afterwards. You can check them. Most of our on these slides, membership is divided by between, okay, most is in the UK, Europe, and then some in the United States and the rest of the world. We have also created committees to discuss particular topics and issues. So far, we have successfully done a free space optical communications committee, which is developing interoperability and standards and to operate optical communications in space. And then we have a regulatory and space policy committee. We had our first meeting, our first sort of formal meeting last week. And then the Lunar Deployment Committee, which Carlos here on this panel is chairing as well. So if you're interested in participating in these committees, please send me an email. We have the email address there below, and we can work something out. Okay, we're ready now to start the webinar. I'm gonna ask the first participant, Carlos, and then Andrew, and after Andrew, Bob, and then after Bob, Peter. I'm gonna, you have 10 minutes each approximately just with your presentation. So I'm gonna go off video and I'm gonna let Carlos share his screen and start the presentations. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. Let me know when you see the screen, if it wants to work. It was working just a minute ago. All right, so everything works, right?
No, I don't see yet the presentation. Okay, now, yes, now it's done.
Now you see it, and now you don't see it again.
It's there, I see it. You have to go
Okay,
in the presentation.
all right, it works. Okay, I don't know why my screen is jumping back and forth between the PowerPoint and the slides. So what I'm gonna do is just share the PowerPoint. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so
I don't see the screen yet. I think it was fine the way you were doing it, Carlos. Even though we weren't seeing the full slide, just go ahead with what you were doing. Otherwise, I can share the screen myself. I can open the presentation and share it.
Sorry about that. My Zoom crashed.
Right.
Interestingly enough. Do you see it now? Do you
Yeah.
see the screen now?
Yeah.
All right. So, hello everyone. I am Carlos Entrena. Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. I am the founder of a brand new company, Plus Ultra Space Outposts. Most of you, or probably all of you, don't know us yet. We started working this year, and we work on space infrastructure. Our first project is related to lunar infrastructure. It's a lunar satellite constellation for communication and navigation services. And precisely about infrastructure is what I'm going to talk about today. So within the topic of the webinar, which is going back to the moon for good, we do believe infrastructure plays a key role, and I'm going to present our vision for why that is like that. So at the moment, as you all probably know, we're at the best moment for the lunar industry. I think there's no doubt about that. We've got record commitment from the governments worldwide with 2 simultaneous lunar programs, plus some other commercial ones. The lunar programs, Artemis, Gateway, already 8 international partners, if I'm counting correctly. We've got a record missions planned between 50 and 90 for the next decade, depending on who you ask, with a high share of those that will be for commercial entities. Record investment in the space sector in general, and also in the infrastructure part of the space sector, and also record number of companies working on lunar activities. There's at least 30 companies working in all sorts of transportation, from landers to space tugs to rovers, and there's an even higher number of those working on surface infrastructure, things like mining, power production, and this is unprecedented. So there's reason to be optimistic for the development of the lunar economy, for going back to the moon for good, but we still have to make it happen. So there's a history of disappointments and a number of canceled programs through the past half a century. And we still have to see successes somewhere. We still have to see a successful lunar return, successful commercial lunar mission, lunar lander, and a successful lunar business in general. So we only have promises at the moment. So with this situation, how do we make it happen? In the end, there's nothing new here. There's 3 key steps that are the same that we would have to take in any kind of other industry. So reduce risks, increase the value of the operations, and increase the long-term returns. For the lunar economy, in our view, that translates in 3 steps that are interrelated. So first is a focus on interpretability and coordination, then is shifting to creating value in space for space, which is increasing the value of the overall economy. And finally, we need to aim to establishing a permanent presence, which is the way in which we will have these increased long-term returns that will make it a real sustainable economy. So how does this work? How does this work in our view? The first is focus on interpretability and coordination, is because no business operates alone. So at the moment we have, or the space industry in general has, this contract mindset, doing one-off systems. We have a standalone mission designs that focus mostly on specific missions and not on having a commercial use. And we always have this ambition of reaching a consensus on how we will go back to the moon, how the lunar base will look like. And this creates risk overall. First, having a contract mindset, having one of the signs just creates risk because we are not able to build heritage. We're not able to, over time, polish the rough edges of the signs. And overall, having this idea of designing a single architecture for lunar missions or for lunar bases will mean an increased risk overall, because we need to make decisions and we need to just go where we haven't gone before, and there will be a number of known unknowns and unknown unknowns that will increase our risk without knowing us. We need to shift from this to a service mindset, so designing systems that work more like infrastructure, that work designed to serve a large number of customers instead of just reaching one single mission objective. We need to shift from a standalone design that companies usually do, working on their own interfaces and their own systems and their own operations to a transparent customer-focused design that makes it easier for new customers to access the services, to access the system, makes it easier for any kind of company to swap systems with each other, swap providers. This eliminates the risk of relying on a single new company that eventually fails to raise money and goes bankrupt, and then the whole mission architecture fails. And we need to shift from this idea of consensus architecture to creative destruction that we do everywhere else on the world in every other industry. So we need to try all the approaches that we can instead of just having all our bets in one single architecture that might or might work or might not work. So interpretability in the end, what it does is ensure that we lower the cost, have easier access to services, and in the end enable new businesses. And coordination in the end will make sure that these services can reach these customers on the moon at the same time. So this is in the end all risk reduction. There is nothing new here. The next step should be about creating new value. In the end, if we want to have a value chain in space, it cannot just go nowhere. It cannot exist on its own. So at the moment we have all the space applications in the end that bring value back to Earth, say communications satellites, say Earth observation satellites, even launch services. In the end, value comes back to Earth. We've got Earth-based end users, and we've got space as an ingredient. So in the end, when we look at the space applications, what most of us think about the space applications, space is just a part of it, but the value in the end, all is on Earth. Think the mega constellations for communications. In the end, for example, Starlink, they operate as an ISP, an internet service provider that has the relay stations in space, but space is just a part of the system. It's not the main value generator of the system. And this will make, if we stick with this role in the end, this is a problem because lunar applications cannot compete with their Earth equivalents, except if we go to science or maybe some military applications. So if we want to create this, increase the value of lunar applications, we need to have this shift in mentality. So have applications that benefit other space applications with space-based end users. Think the most immediate ones are things like satellite servicing, but of course, manufacturing, mining, even communications infrastructure on the moon would be one of these. And we need businesses that have space as a recipe. So they require that they happen in space and they create value in space and is used in space. In the end, what this creates is that we have a value chain that ends somewhere in space, ideally on the moon. And that creates an economic reason to keep doing them instead of just relying on an artificial demand created, say, by government contracts. And then the final one is that no economy functions alone. So if we have an activity in space, we cannot economically justify it indefinitely unless we have an actual reason to go there. So we cannot have a standalone industry that relies on missions and that relies on, for example, science activities. We need to shift from sporadic demand, supply-driven missions that we have at the moment. So the government says, I want this number of missions, and people please jump in. And we have to shift from this demand based on science and exploration to the end goal that has to be lunar living. So a continuous demand that serves lunar businesses, missions that are driven by demands. And so users that want to actually go to the moon instead of flight opportunities, they demand the flights. And then eventually we need human demands. So we need the consumer end. We need to shift from just doing things because of science, which is in the end a very small industry, to having a value sink, an end point of the value chain on the moon that needs human. This means that our industry should focus on eventually having a permanent presence, and that's having people living on the moon that demand services, and that will be the only way in which we eventually have an economy. That is how it works on Earth. We have, in the end, we do things because people demand things. That's how that's what drives economics in the end. So we need to replicate that on the moon if we want to stay there. So this is where infrastructure, in our view, comes in. Infrastructure fits all the parts of the bill. it demands that we do it in an interoperable way and coordinated way. Infrastructure needs to serve everyone. Imagine if you wanted to switch internet provider and you need a completely new internet installation on your home, that doesn't work. It needs to be interoperable. It needs to create value in a space for a space. If we have infrastructure in space, that means that the users will be in a space. There will be other businesses that work there in a space, and in the end, infrastructure drives or supports this continuous presence that will be the key to having a sustainable space economy that does not rely continuously on government subsidies. And this is the situation that we want to replicate in the end. This is what the role that Plus Ultra wants to have. So at the moment, we are just seeing the early missions, or we will be seeing the early missions hopefully within the next year or two. These early missions serve as the basis to enable the orbital infrastructure. They will be the early customers of any orbital infrastructure that creates this cycle of sustaining presence, then enabling further infrastructure, then sustaining long duration presence. And in the end, this is the cycle that we want to enable by deploying the first orbital infrastructure on the moon. Once we reach this point, we need to move on from orbital to surface. I think I'm not saying anything new there, but we need to, this shift in the mindset, instead of having businesses and missions that operate on their own, we need to start deploying the basis of the economy that will eventually sustain all further activities. And with that, that ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much. We'll wait for Q&A after we finish with the presentations and the panel session. Now we have Andrew. Andrew, if you can actually share your screen and put on your video as well, Andrew.
Oh, right.
If people can see you as you speak as well. And share your screen. Thank you. Excellent. I can see you. And now, okay, we can see your slides as well. Thank you.
Okay. So, Carlos, I loved your presentation. I thought it was really excellent that you started out with the concept of risk. It's not surprising in a way, since Carlos, Peter, and I are actually working together on at least one project. So let me go then right away. I'm not going to even try and get slideshow to work, since we had problems with that early. Okay, so I start with the concept of risk. And the issue that we've got is that we see a future of lunar-based resources, as Carlos discussed, and it's an alluring future, because if you can actually, just as an example, get rocket fuel from the moon, we're all familiar with that. It would fundamentally change some of the things that we do, the way we operate in space. You know, one of the real challenges of space has always been Earth to orbit launch. I actually believe that the best way to solve the problem of Earth to orbit launch is by launching things off of the moon. As much of the mass as you can, get it off of the moon rather than the Earth. The problem is, there is perhaps a business case in the future for lunar-based propellants. And we're all looking forward to the day when we have the first contract for 1 million tons of lunar propellant signed by, whether it's a company or whether it's a country. The problem is, there's a massive amount of risk between here and there. And it's risk that's probably inappropriate for either government or industry to absorb this risk. And so we are heading down, I think, the correct path of public-private partnerships sharing the risk. But we don't have a really good conception of that. So if we look at some of the programs, and this is not surprisingly, at least very US centered, that's where my experience base is. And our experience with balancing risk between government and industry hasn't been entirely positive. If you start at the top here with the original EELV, Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle Program, the initial program involved industry taking on virtually all of the cost risk and the revenue risk. Government put up about $500 million per company to support a development program that cost on the order of, let's say, about $3 billion by the time Lockheed and Boeing finished their respective launch vehicle programs, and it was a complete disaster. I can tell you publicly, Boeing wrote down almost $2 billion, and that's shareholder value, which was destroyed. It was an economic disaster. And so what happened as a result of that, the government, and I think that both Boeing and Lockheed were very close to walking away from those contracts. The government restructured their contracts, and the government took on all of the risk without getting into a whole lot of details. And that ultimately proved to be politically unsustainable, because it put the government in a very bad position where they were taking on virtually all of the cost risk, all of the market risk. And so both the cost and the revenue risk. And then ultimately, just recently, that contract has been rebalanced to something that I think makes a little bit more sense, where I think there's a balance of risk between government and industry. There are other programs, I'm not going to go into all of them, but the X-33 program was a case where industry took on a massive amount of technical risk, and ultimately they failed. And a very interesting and I think successful program was the COTS program, which evolved to be the cargo resupply services. And that turned out to be a pretty good balance. And we kind of looked at that as the future. And unfortunately, I don't think we're really drawing the right lessons from that. If we look at the CLIPS program, which is the most recent lunar program, there is sort of a balance of risk right now, but that's kind of artificial in that the reason it makes sense for industry to take on what would normally be kind of an inordinate amount of risk is that industry has already developed most of the systems that need to be developed in order to go to the moon. Astrobotic was already complete. Intuitive Machines had done a great deal of work before the government had to throw in any money. And so that's kind of a little artificial. I'm not sure how sustainable a model is where essentially the government offers to maybe buy something from you, maybe at some point in the future, and you put up all the development money to actually create a new system. I don't think long-term that's a very sustainable proposition. So what I want to look at now is the balance of risk. Now, everyone wants to get into the green part of risk, and if I'm going to go through this by starting by talking about from the industry standpoint. One of the basic risks that they face is they don't really know what the development costs are going to be, and so as a result, they would like to see government fund the development. Well, if you go over here to the government side, they would like to see industry pay for the development risks, and so right there's a conflict. If you look at the market side of it, industry would like to see government issue long-term sole source agreements for a single provider. Government, on the other hand, doesn't really want to take on the risk of that one supplier failing, so they'd like to have multiple suppliers. They would like to have competition. The more suppliers from their perspective, the better. So once again, you see that there's a fundamental conflict in the risk profiles for those two. If we go to the next risk, operational costs, the industry would like to see government provide the infrastructure as government furnished equipment. Government, on the other hand, would like to see industry pay for the facilities. And so ultimately then, financing costs can be a risk for industry, and so they'd like to see government loan guarantees. Government hates loan guarantees for things like this. The political optics of it are terrible. And so you end up with a situation where all of these various risks have to be negotiated. And we really haven't thought that through very well in the US, at least. I think it's interesting. I think some good academic work could be done on this through reference to some of the public-private partnerships in Europe. In Europe, you have much greater experience with doing public-private partnerships. Space is a challenging place to do these kinds of things. Anyway, I think that we need to have a little bit more systematic processes of negotiating through these things if we're going to be successful. I think that the current approach we're on right now is going to be tough. The risks are so long-term and so sustained and so costly that it's going to be a real challenge. So thank you for your time. And I'll just refer you back to the Center for Space Entrepreneurship at Florida Tech in a partnership with with International Space University. And, point out this is where we all want to be. So thank you very much, Tony, for having me here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. Great presentation, great topic on financing these mega projects. Let's go, before we ask Q&As, don't answer them, please, by writing back. We're going to have them live. I'm going to actually talk about Q&A live, basically, and you can respond live. Next speaker, so Andrew, if you can actually stop your video. Next speaker, we're going to have Bob. So Bob, if you can put on your presentation and you can present it. If you're having an issue, I could put the presentation from this side.
Let's see. I think I'm okay. Hang on just a second. Let me put it up. You're going to have to disable you're going to have to give me access to the screen, Tony.
You should have that already, but if you don't, I'll check now, but you should have that already. Let me see. Oh, no, you're not. Okay, I'll do it now.
Okay.
Okay, you're on now?
Okay. And I will set.
Meantime, anyone that has any questions, please write them on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Okay. Can everybody, can you see that, Tony?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I appreciate the fact that we have started this this presentation about something aspirational and exciting, which is basically returning to the moon, with the cold hard facts that this activity from a commercial standpoint has to take into consideration risk. It also has to take into consideration what would be some of the challenges associated with, although not referenced specifically, the availability of government as a partner, a reliable partner, which would imply also the reliability of government budgets and planning. I know with the new incoming Biden administration, there's already the paranoia that everything that was on the table 6 months ago with respect to Artemis may in fact be off the table for a few years. So this is not a risk-reward environment right now. It appears to be, from a policy standpoint, risk. But let's look more aspirational here for a second and take a step back. My training is as a lawyer and also as a finance person. So that makes me somewhat of a paranoid schizophrenic. And so when I look at something like this, particularly returning to the moon, the first thing I try to look at is what are the underpinning questions that we want to deal with. And these are the ones that I see in business cases. These are more formally presented, but on a sort of the checklist between, are you serious about wanting to do what you're doing, or do you have something that would be closer to a sustainable business case in 2021, 2022, 2023, and on. So when we say we're going back to the moon, government, we know what they mean, but what would the private sector be talking about? Is it orbiting around the moon? Is it on the lunar surface like a lander? And which side of the moon? Chinese are on the dark side. That creates serious communications challenges unless there's some additional infrastructure to rely on. Are we there for the interim or permanent? Are we going to build off of landers that are only there on average about 8 days? Or are we going to be looking at building something more like Artemis, which would be a longer term habitation? Who's leading it? What's your schedule? This is certainly from a finance standpoint important, because these kind of projects are capital intensive. They're long lead time and long lead time to revenue. Those are basically three legs that have to be balanced in planning. You need a lot of money up front. You need it over a period of time. And you're not looking at, even with pre-subscription, which is a promise to pay, anything relative to revenue coming in until you actually deliver the product or the service. How are you going to do it? Landers, modules, they all have a whole variety of different challenges associated with them. And then finally, are you going to be public dependent, private dependent? are, as been discussed previously, public-private partnerships, which quite candidly are only as strong as the public part. The private part is one where it's only going to attract capital if the public is there. The public can proceed without the private investment on its own, if funded by the Congress, for example. So with those kind of Q's and A's, you then let's go back to take one further step back, and that is, what does it take? Historically, we're going to the moon. Okay, in telecom, which is my business, the moon is really just the ultimate edge relative to telecommunications and communication services. So whether we're looking at Northwest Territories in Australia, or we're looking at a underserved or infrastructure light area in Africa, we're looking at possibly a lunar communications network. What are the things that a migrating humankind would need to be looking at in order to basically go off planet, and in this case, go to the moon? It breaks down into 5 general areas. One is we're going to need communications, and there is some priority to this. You really need to be able to communicate, and I use the American West as an example of migration off planet. For example, in this case, we had the telegraph, and then in the 21st century we have the cloud. We have the ability to do wireless in the right wireless environment. And the moon, luckily, is a vacuum. So for my business, particularly optical communications, it's a much more friendly environment than it would be with an atmospheric challenged area like the Earth. We have a need for habitation, shelter to survive and then thrive. We had sod houses in the West. Where are we going to find and who's going to come in and build the rad-free, maybe below ground in lava tubes, self-contained facilities? And can they be built with robotics versus what would be actual human managers or human involvement on the lunar surface? If they can, then robotics, using some of the examples of Rio Tinto in the Northwest Territories of Australia, consume significant amount of bandwidth, which gets me back to communications. The ability to manage what would be remotely robotic activity to accomplish certain tasks. Transportation, we had the railroad. Today, we got SpaceX, we've got Ariane. Ariane has a lunar insertion vehicle with Ariane 6, it's planned. So there are vehicles here, but the price per pound of space is still pretty expensive. And so the ability to move people versus move stuff that you need probably is more near term. But when you move people, you add, as you all know, a different level of different challenge. And that's really common carrier rules relative to be able to protect people. Property rights. This is a big one. I put it down here as 4, but quite candidly, the arguments have already started as to who owns the moon. And you're going to get a business case that says, I want to do X. I want to extract minerals here. And somebody's going to say, you can't because you don't own that. And until that's solved, and I don't mean unilaterally, until it's solved as a community decision, as a lawyer, I can tell you that's going to be a problem. Because if you have a permanent habitation, you have regularly scheduled transportation with communications, and you're starting to extract things of value that you went there to begin with to extract, and you find out you have a challenge when you get back here to the Earth on who owns it, it's going to kill that. And you need to know ahead of time. That's a level of uncertainty you have to remove. Law and order. Law and order is simple. I put down here the 19th century cavalry outpost, but the true example of law and order, at least in the American West, was the Colt 45. Made everybody equal. In the 21st century, it's going to have to be a combination of international organizations, Space Force, equivalents in Europe, equivalents in other countries, and all cooperating and working together. That is to avoid what is a very bad history of the last 2 millennia on humankind moving into new territories where there is incredible riches available, turning us into a colonization process instead of into a nationalization or internationalization process. Then, of course, you have the basics. And this schedule I have here By the way, there's a picture in the upper right-hand corner. That's my homage to our holiday today. The schedule we have here is based on a ComStar demand survey that went out to 3,000 folks back in September. We got about 300 responses, and out of the 300 responses, I'd say we hit about 90% of what would be those that have already put capital at risk, public, private, or both, in terms of programs. And a number of those were mentioned, programs were mentioned in the last two speakers. The migration process historically has been led by explorers and pathfinders. Well, in this case, 21 to 25, it's landers, and more landers. 8 days, 6 days, capabilities, payloads that do a variety of things on a small scale, admittedly. Based on the responses around 2024, and we've tried to take Artemis out of this and government funded programs out of this, to 2030, we're seeing an uptick in interest in bidirectional communications, particularly on the lunar surface or around the moon, like Moonlight and ComStar. Transportation, there are now plans for different types of transportation vehicles that, assuming that the cargo requirement is there, which leads back to habitation. We have Artemis and we have Outpost, but the long-term habitation activities, for example, would be United Space Structures, USS, which is looking at basically developing structures, living structures below the surface of the moon. Mining resource and development investigations, those are landers first, and then they're actually robotic activities for deeper scale. And then logistical services, which are ultimately going to have to be done, as it was mentioned earlier. You have to grow, find, deliver, process, and supply for lunar activity on the moon itself. If you're continuing to wait for the wooden ships to sail to the new world, you're going to find yourself like Williamsburg in Virginia to have dying times where people are actually not going to survive. Security is important, as is the military aspects of this. And then onward, permanent settlements. Where? Meaning, if everybody is landing in 15 or 20 different places because they just want privacy, you're not going to have settlements. You're not going to have communities. You need to cluster around something. And that really is a role government could play. If not, then it's going to be settlements, and they're all going to be disextended, and the only way to save them relative to their growth would be communications on the lunar surface or through a Moonlight orbiting constellation with a space relay through a satellite system like ComStar. Industrial development, it's going to go where the products are. Does that mean they're near the settlements? Maybe, maybe not. But if they're not, then you have to be able to get it to the settlement. Scientific investigation and security, the same. The good news is that based on the survey and the economics that were being put out, it reinforces that there is an acknowledgement of risk, and there is also an acknowledgement that there is capital flowing into what would be common sense, early stage, step-by-step evolutions off the planet to the moon, where it can be translated into return. Brief 1-minute note on ComStar. This is a lunar relay system. It's at L1. It's a network access point located for everybody. This is our contribution to the communication side of it. It connects to laser light for distribution on the Earth, as well as a partner, Atlas Space Operations. I'm not going to go through these. They'll be in the slides that Tony will provide you. But the point being is that, as our previous speakers had said, you got to balance risk reward. You also have to balance who your partner is, but you have to build in an evolutionary sense on things that synergize not just what you're doing, but what somebody else is doing as a way of building that infrastructure and also that capital return potential that would make in the near term, I mean in the next 10 years, something that would be attractive to invest in. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you for providing the communications to the moon. We have Peter now. Peter?
Yes, hello. Let me just share here for a second. Can everybody see my
Yep.
screen? Hang on, I just think I have to switch the display setting here.
That's
So
fine.
it's be full screen now, right?
No, we can see. Yeah, now full screen. Okay, thank you.
Okie dokie. Yes, hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. As I was pulling a few slides together for this presentation, we are just in the middle of creating a new handbook, Andy and I as editors, because my old lunar base handbook from 1999, it's been a while, is kind of out of print and not available anymore. So I was kind of looking into the old stuff, and when you look in the old stuff, sometimes it's surprising how the old stuff is still very current. So I want to look at 3 angles here today in a few slides, and then share a few considerations that are probably important to all of us. On the one hand, looking back a little bit for inspiration. It's kind of a fun bit, what others thought before us and how we can maybe leverage that. And then think about commercialization in two directions, if you will. To think on the one hand that if you want to really commercialize, you got to have some stuff that others are willing to pay money for. Sounds simple enough, but in the space arena, and I've been around for a while, that understanding of commercial is not always that much of a given. And the second notion of commercialization is that ultimately, down the road, we would really want to think profit equals revenue minus cost. And one person that gives me very much hope there is, for example, Jeff Bezos, because he's always doing stuff for the money. We'll see how he manages to do that with Blue Origin, because it's about the profit in the end when you really commercialize. So let's go back a few centuries, ballpark, and look at our forefathers here, and Ziakovsky and Obert in 1900, 1923. It's quite interesting. Konstantin Ziakovsky was pretty much a visionary. When you look at what he laid out, his 16 steps, I mean, step 16 is the end of our solar system. He went all the way to the end. But in his logic, starting to think about really going into space and then having spacesuits and space stations and such, like we're around whatever, step 7, 8, 9, 10. So somewhere in the middle of his vision. Whereas Obert was, interestingly enough, much more pragmatic, because he had his four kind of theses. And the fourth one, see, it has the word profitable. So that was kind of weird, because those of you who are familiar with history, the PhD thesis he wrote, these 4 sentences in was not accepted. It was just too much for folks here in Germany about 100 years ago. So he never received a proper PhD, the poor man. But he was right in such that, he says, spaceflight can be profitable. Already, he lived to see it. It already happened 50, 60 years later. That's quite fascinating, because they were not really taken too seriously. Jumping ahead about 50 years, a name that is hopefully familiar to most of you, but I'm suspecting not to all, is someone named Kraft. He was also busy in the US at NASA from the 50s. And he was one of the real pioneers of thinking what to do with the moon in terms of like really commercialization. And he had this thing called the extraterrestrial imperative. And this is from an article in New York Times in 1972. So think about that here. If you look at this, he was really thinking about everything you could sell and do, and have an oxygen industry, a metal industry, a silicon industry, large structures on the moon and such. So pretty amazing. And back in the day, we thought it's going to happen soon. And sadly, here we are in 2020. And I agree with Carlos. Hope we're going to see a lot of landers very shortly, and actually see stuff happening along with commercial communication systems and all. Because by the end of the day, our options are relatively limited when it comes to the more interesting exploratory stuff. This is again from the old Lunar Base Handbook, because we're basically having a space station now. It's onto the moon or to Mars. And just another thought that came up 20-ish years ago, I found myself on a panel with Bob Zubrin, who was very famous then, and I wasn't famous then, probably not famous now, but he said, well, forget about moon, it's all going to be Mars, Mars, Mars. And I didn't believe it. And here we are 20 years later. Mars is way out there, and I think we should really focus on the moon. And we're in this phase now where we're really running precursors now. It was like nothing happening for 20, 30 years almost. Very, very little, the occasional Clementine or Lunar Prospector, and now the last few years now we're really starting it. So we can now think about outposts, man-tended, permanent crews, production facilities, and we should really think in that logic, not forget about that logic. And side note, always try to see how can we make this whole thing commercial. And what can we make commercial? That is a sweet old table from Herman Kolle, who's actually creating the first lunar base study in, I think it was 1956, that was pre-NASA. And so he was thinking this through until 2010 when he passed on, and he was always hopeful that ultimately the day we come, we're going to do all these things. So yeah, let's think about these things and maybe think about stuff, tele-entertainment, tele-education. That's not going to be the big bucks, but liquid propellants, maybe they are bigger bucks, and all the other things that we can mine on the moon. Thinking about mining, I mean, I'm super bullish about this. I've always been, but we should not forget that, you know, one step at a time. What always gets me is that, you know, and he knows what I mean, you know, years ago, well, we're already having a contract to sell some lunar oxygen. I'm excited we sell some lunar oxygen, but hey, before we have contracts and commercialize lunar oxygen, let's get started on creating a little bit of lunar oxygen for starters, whether we do this more equatorial, where it's also pretty cold at times, but not as bad, or if we really find a lot of ice inside or near the craters in the poles, it's going to be an engineering challenge to extract this lunar oxygen. Let's go do it and make it happen, and then I'm sure we find a way to commercialize that. But what I'm really eager to see is real stuff happening. And we thought about that 20 years ago when as students we had the, for those in Europe who remember it, the LunarSat precursor mission to Euromoon 2000, which of course never happened. But that was the idea, to go to the lunar South Pole 20-something years ago. Uwe Ockels, God bless his soul, was really trying to push this hard. And I really hope that, as all of us, we're gonna see these happen, these things, the landers and the lunar oxygen, because the good stuff is all out there, and the concepts are there. It's all about doing things, and the doing things, again, you know, it's going to be an interesting chapter in the new Lunar Base Handbook, a Handbook of Lunar Base Design and Development, as it will be called, and we hope to have it out next year, Andy and I, to really see what these processes can be, because they are endless for those of you who have been dealing with ISRU on the moon. Of course, when we're talking about commercialization, one key factor we should never forget, and I did my PhD thesis like sadly almost a quarter century ago around this topic, because I really want to see lunar bases happen, but I also want to be realistic about it. And finally, we're seeing real progress, I guess, on the launcher front in terms of the cost, mainly driven by, of course, SpaceX. So costs are really going down, but still, you know, to get to the moon is not cheap. There's a little bit of a formula that you may or may not want to use, but that's something I plugged here from my PhD thesis and some work from Color. We just have to keep little things in mind, that, you know, what's the factor of getting stuff from low Earth orbit to the lunar surface. So that factor, depending on how you get there, and is somewhere from one kilogram in low Earth orbit to the lunar surface is a factor from 7 to 3 ballpark, depending on how you do this. And then the other thing to be kept in mind is that you know, that 1 kilogram on the moon ends up costing somewhere between formerly 100,000 and now it's probably closer to $10,000 a kilo. So if you do the math and bring some equipment up there and do a little operations cost, it's still not cheap. And you know, when you see some concepts that tell us whatever the numbers are, we're going to have some lunar bases for 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 billion. That is and remains absolute nonsense if you just take these numbers. But nevertheless, I think we're getting closer. We're really getting close. And if we want to commercialize, let's think about everything we can commercialize and keep that commercialization notion in mind, because that's the only enabler. And you know, I think again, the SpaceX story is super encouraging. What we saw a few weeks ago, you know, that actually NASA just buys the service now and flies people to ISS. That's the way. It's not really truly commercial because it's a lot of government money involved, but I think it's a step in the right direction, and I hope to see more happen soon. And thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Peter. Let's have everybody else coming back. In the meantime, as we wait for everybody to come back, I want to show you something which you may or may not be aware of. Can you see my screen with this presentation, maybe?
Not yet.
Okay, I have to share my screen. Well, I was part of the ISU in 1993 with a few people here on the attendance, actually. We where about 50, 60 students, within 10 weeks, we developed a 400-page report on the Lunar Far-Side Observatory, basically, and how we actually managed to get there, and also do a lunar base within a 10 years time frame. And that's in 1993, and we were using laser communications. I was the only communications guy in the team, and so I developed the laser communication from L2 orbit behind the moon to back to the geostationary satellite systems. So there has been a lot of work, as Peter actually shown in the past, actually, and the ISU was doing something in 92, and I was almost actually hired by the European Space Agency in 95 to develop this, but it never happened. So it's happening now. So I'm very, very proud of this. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and your project. So we're gonna now maybe spend about 5 minutes. Let me just check first of all if Javier Labao, our keynote speaker, is actually arrived. I'm gonna check the attendance. I don't see Javier yet logged in. He's actually gonna log in from Greece. Let me find out. In the meantime, I suggest that we have a small panel session between the 4 speakers and myself, maybe just to talk a little bit about a topic of your interest, but mainly, at least of my interest, would be understanding, as most of you actually talked about, how do you sustain financially an activity on the longer term on the moon? Maybe trying to discuss this issue. Okay, we have to spend initial investment to get to the moon, but then eventually you want to keep people on the moon and so on. So what's the way to actually sustain that financially? And also, does that actually replace what we're doing at the ISS or not? So with that in mind, maybe I would like to get maybe a reaction from the panelists.
Sure, I think I can take one, Tony. I think the only way that we manage to get a long-term sustainable presence on the moon has to be by replicating what we have on Earth. I mean, we need people living there and demanding services, and same as on Earth, people will have to have jobs that create value somewhere else. They create economic value and companies that pay them, but that requires continuous presence. I don't know exactly what kind of activities those will be yet. I can figure things, manufacturing or propellant production to supply orbital services, to supply satellite servicing, for example, supply missions to Mars, scientific facilities, military facilities. That will be something that I think we will eventually see at some point. And those are the things that eventually sustain human presence anywhere. I mean, look at Earth. Why are people on islands in the middle of the ocean? Well, or in Antarctica. Well, they have a job and they demand services that others have to provide, and that's how you have sustainability. In the end, same as on Earth, why do economies work on Earth? Well, there's people living and working, and that's what we need. That's the point we need to reach.
Yeah, this is Bob. I think this is a preference, obviously, and a prejudice, but I think it starts with the first impact of lunar activity is going to be in the communications area. We're finding that we've signed up, Comstar has signed up now, relationship with all the CLIPS partners in some form or another, and have also begun the process of dealing with the longer habitation. And in creating what would be, to answer your question, Tony, about how do you finance something like this, you have to show the revenue potential against what would cost. Comstar's capital strategy, which I'm not shy to mention, is that the first 5 years is going to be basically a loss leader if you're just relying on communications, based even on the missions that we know are going to be there. The second 5, the bandwidth consumption we estimate on the moon will go from megabit traffic to gigabit traffic to petabit traffic. And in the last 5 years, because it's a 15-year life, is going to go to something more analogous to what we see now here in the cloud with it, which would be exabits and potentially zetabit traffic because of the heavy reliance on robotics. So if you can survive the first 5, then you're going to make it the rest of the way. And I think that's true of habitation. There's got to be some way to survive the first evolution in order to make enough stability to be able to survive the next iteration. And it's probably true of every one of those elements of habitation, communications, transportation, et cetera. And that's a role that government can play. We don't have any government participation in our program, but that's because the government is stimulating the users, meaning the landers. If they weren't, then I think the landers themselves would find it very difficult to be as robust as they are right now.
Thank you. Anybody else, Andrew or Peter?
Oh, I just say, I'll echo what Carlos said. The best way to ensure sustainable lunar presence is companies making money on the moon. As long as it's economically self-sustaining, we will continue to be on the moon. If we rely on governments to support it, it will not be long-term self-sustaining, because at some point we're going to get tired of the moon and we're going to go to Mars.
And Peter, you actually muted. You need to unmute.
Thanks. I was just about to say, the thing is, we just have to keep pushing in the direction. We'll find it. I mean, Andy and I, we're both bullish about helium-3, yes, but it's just a few years down the road, I'm afraid, till we have the mining facilities to do helium-3. Maybe that's a big economic winner down the road. It's just not immediately around the corner, but I think we should try these things. Communications with bits and bytes having very low mass, actually no mass, is always a helpful one, because no mass is helping in space. You don't have to transport anything. So we have to push in this direction. We'll find the things we need to find, and just have to target sustainability.
So I also want to comment on what Bob said. He raises a really, really important point, which is the temporal aspect of it, and surviving the first 5 years. That the risk is, I mean, you can come up with an appropriate sort of public-private partnership. If we were smart, we could figure that out. The challenge, though, is we've been extraordinarily bad at predicting timelines in space. And so that is a risk, and it's a risk that we have to think about. How do you mitigate that? Because capital is not patient. I mean, that's one of the real challenges, is the impatience of particularly venture capital. I mean, there are relatively more patient forms of capital, the best being the government. But Bob raises a really important point that I think we have to think through a lot. And I like your capital plan. It's one of the most logical I've heard.
I think go ahead,
I
Bob,
appreciate
sorry.
Our first 5 years this is a large satellite that we have planned. So consequently, as with other types of projects, what else can you do with that infrastructure beside the logical part, which in our case is a data relay satellite? Is there anything else you can do with it? And the answer is, we have found that it also sits at 200,000 miles away from the Earth, but it looks back at the Earth. It's all line of sight to the Earth. So it has a high degree of possibility to be a hosted payload platform. So you put hosted payloads like situational awareness, PNT, et cetera, all looking back at the Earth. That's a secondary line, but that could be your primary line of revenue in your first 5 years, with comms being your secondary. Mm-hmm. And then as those hosted payloads either die off, wind up, or program, end, you've now bridged that gap between the infrastructure you expect to develop on the moon to, in fact, infrastructure and users that are there, and the payloads become then a secondary part of it. That's at least the plan. It's still a couple of years before you do it, but my sense is that there are other plans like that if you can look at what else you can do while you're doing this, like the landers, you're carrying payloads. And so the payloads are really the ones that are paying the freight, literally. Mm-hmm. What are the different payloads that they're doing that you can diversify your risk? And I think Astrobotics and Maston and Intuitive Machines are thinking that way, that they're just not they're not a truck driver. They're looking at other ways of mitigating the risk.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that from the perspective of international law and the Aerospace Treaty, Peter just dropped out. I think a lot of the viewers of this sort of session webinar are most likely questioning themselves about the outer space treaties and their implication, basically. I suppose that a lot of this needs to be reviewed because if there is some kind of exploitation of the moon, and if you need to make some kind of a profits or some kind of a sustainability financially by commercializing the moon somehow, we will need to look into the international law consequences and see how that could actually happen. I can only see this happening most likely to some kind of international collaboration or international sort of agreement, which in a way tries to overcome some of the restrictions you have in the Outer Space Treaty, most likely as well the Moon Treaty. Any views on that?
I do, and it's heretical, probably. You know, a good friend of mine is a lawyer, so I have lawyers for friends too, believe it or not. And he gave me a T-shirt. It says, "Where explorers go, lawyers follow." It really needs to have a postscript, which is at an acceptable distance. We will, as we have done everywhere, figure out what worries me is that we put a legal regime. I mean, right now, the Outer Space Treaty is a little fuzzy, to say the least, and the Moon Treaty is largely disregarded. And so we need a better legal regime than what we have. But I would hate to put a legal regime in place before we know what the heck we're really doing there, what the real issues are going to be. And I think what's going to happen is that we're going to evolve a sort of a set of common law principles through the operations and what we are going to do on the lunar surface. And then we'll figure out how to codify what makes sense rather than the other way around.
Let me actually clarify. It's actually not the lawyers here. It's actually to do with treaties and basically to do with how member states or states of the United Nations actually try to do things internationally. Lawyers are only there just to make sure the laws are not broken, basically. But it's more. It's actually much more wider than that. So it's all about how countries interact with each other, and that's why I mentioned earlier, just now, a few minutes ago, that maybe some kind of international agreement between states may be required, which maybe not contradict, or maybe does contradict the Moon Treaty or the Outer Space Treaty somehow, but at least to overcome the difficulties in modifying the Outer Space Treaties, maybe some kind of international agreement could be required.
Well, you sort of see that with the Artemis Accords, which are interesting and may be creating political camps on the moon. But I mean, that's the sort of evolution that we're seeing right now. What's happening is a group of nations are kind of developing what they perceive to be their own interpretation of what the Outer Space Treaty means. And I think countries outside the Artemis Accords may have a very different interpretation.
There are some comments from people on the chat from Terry Trevino saying that we tried with Artemis Accord and China did not participate. So sorry, China, he says, they were at the table. I mean, look, I think we shouldn't actually worry about each individual country at the moment or what their views are, but eventually something needs to happen internationally. Again, it's not.
I think the key word here, Tony, I think the key word is eventually. And because we need to look at two realities that when we talk about international cooperation, we essentially disregard. The first one is that the moon is very big. So it will be some time until we have missions overlapping and we have potential problems with interference from each other. And then the second one is that for the foreseeable future, the next 10 years or so, there will be only one country sending regularly missions to the moon, which will be the US. So yes, the Artemis Accords are an interesting approach, but there will be some time until we actually need any kind of international agreement to avoid conflicts. I mean, even if you go the way of the property rights, if the US recognizes property rights for their companies, who's going to go there and enforce it otherwise if they don't have the technology or the capability? So that's the reality we need to look at. Of course, more, let's say, consensus approach might work, but given the current political situation and kind of arms race in space that we're seeing, I don't think that will be in the cards anytime soon.
Okay, if you allow me, unfortunately, Javier Lobao is not able to make it because his 5 o'clock meeting has been put forward right now, so we can't actually have him right now or present his presentation. Basically, we have 20 minutes left, and I want to maybe start taking the Q&A, the questions here we have on the Q&A box. Let's see. First of all, comment from Dominic from the European Commission. He disagrees with you, Carlos, but I also disagree with you, Carlos, I have to say.
I agree with Carlos.
On property rights, I'm sorry, but we have to go through some kind of international agreement. You just can't claim property on the moon. But nevertheless,
one point on that. So I agree with your views. I'm just saying I don't think that's how it will happen, because
okay,
the people that can actually go to the moon does not need it to happen that way. So it would be better to have something sooner rather than later. I do not expect that we have something sooner rather than later.
No, I agree. Totally agree with that. Let's go. If you allow me now, I'm gonna go question by question on the Q&A session, Q&A window here. Any participant attendees, if you have any questions, just put them on the screen here, write them down. I have so far 9 questions, so I'm gonna go one by one. We may not be able to answer everything, so let's start with the first one. Let's see. We had one from Conrad. I think, let me just check. There was one. Kenneth was the first one who came on board. Kenneth was the first one, actually. I have no time tag here. What is your elevator pitch for politicians to give when they are selling this to very large spend to the public, especially in the current climate, when the response may be, why are we spending money on this instead of X? I suppose there is a lot of problems with COVID pandemic and economic downfall in many countries in the world. So what's your views here, guys?
I'll take this one on. So the first thing that in the United States you need to understand is that space spending is an accepted norm. NASA is going to get $20 billion, and they're going to spend about half of it on human spaceflight. You don't need to sell that. It's already sold. The question is really, what do you do with that? So we argue over whether we're going to the moon or whether we're going to Mars, and we politicize it, and every 8 years we change our mind. I think the pitch that needs to be made, it isn't for the spending. It's how do we ensure that we don't just go to the moon and do flags and footprints like we did before, and then we're done with it. We go to Mars, except it'll take us another 50 years to go to Mars. I think the pitch that needs to be made is why we pursue lunar development rather than just lunar exploration. And I think the answer to that is there is a space economy there's a potential for a space economy, and that economy will be based on the moon. And that's the pitch. But I think in many ways in the United States in particular, we do more damage than good by arguing about space and whether, about the politicization of space. We would be better off just saying, look, we're going to get our $20 billion. Let's put our head down and do the right thing with it.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages, Andy, here is that soon we'll be in the position to actually do stuff. For the last 20, 30 years, it was all about developing the necessary key infrastructure element, AKA a launcher, to actually get us to the moon, right? Now the launch business has been transformed. Still in the background, I'm very hopeful what Blue Origin is doing, SpaceX is doing. So this is kind of happening. So we're enabled finally to do stuff. So we don't have to say, give us billions and gazillions first to maybe do something, but first we need 10 years to develop it. Think about the space station Freedom that became ISS. So we can now shortly talk about, we'd like to go to the moon and do a mission to whatever, generate lunar oxygen, to explore that, do a science experiment, something else. So it will be tangible. And also it will probably get some public interest / attention, which was not really there since the Apollo days to a certain level. It's just coming back with SpaceX and all that. The space station is up there for 20 years and occasionally some new astronauts, but that's not really getting anyone super excited. But we're now on the verge of doing really exciting stuff that the public will say, wow, we're going to fly to the South Pole of the Moon. We're going to do this experiment. We're going to do this. So we're going to have headline makers and politicians like that. So I think that enabling is going to be incredibly helpful.
I'll go to the next question. Maybe I'll pick one for Bob. Just a second. There was one on 4G, 5G. Where is it? I think I had it here. There it is, from Vincent. Vincent, any inputs about GPS or 4G, 5G on the moon? And so see the latest announcement from Nokia. What milestones and what timescale?
The future of 4G, 5G, I have to admit to you, it's really more realistically 6G. That's what the Chinese are working on right now. But for all of our benefit, it's just microwave communications at the higher bands. What is the future of that on the moon? It's got a terrific future. It's efficient in a vacuum. From a transportable standpoint, it's probably more efficient to use on the lunar surface, and what we used to call a repeater network. So if you again, the only basis we can kind of go off of what worked on the Earth, and is it transportable, transferable as a concept and architecture to the moon. So if you look at where wireless came from and analog to digital, et cetera, it started with circles of service. In other words, you got a license in, say, downtown New York or in London or somewhere else, and you built an infrastructure, partly because of cost, partly because of demand, partly because of revenue in that particular location. So on the moon, can you designate what would be an area where people are clustering or robotics are clustering? And then you say that's a circle of service. And then now you have customers, potential revenue to justify the infrastructure to be deployed. This is a little bit more cost effective than just throwing the idea out, which is ridiculous, that we're going to build a Wi-Fi network all over the planet, all over the moon. It's going to start in a circle of service around paying customers or customers who need communications horizontally on the lunar surface that then go to a hub that are backhauled. Someone else had asked, what can Astrobotics and Maston do in addition to the other things that they're doing? Part of it is becoming part of infrastructure that does this sort of backhaul function. So that's 4G, 5G, 6G, and the ability to do what Nokia is doing, other than that being a demo project. I think it's going to be the private sector that leads the way, and it's because there's going to be a demand for the communications away from the landers that have to be able to cluster comms to get the data back. And they'll either get it back to Moonlight, or they'll get it back to somebody else, and then they'll get it hopefully to Comstar, and then we'll get it to the rest of the world.
Question from Martina. Thank you, Bob. Martina Lofquist. What are some existing programs that work towards expanding the collaboration between the commercial and governmental side, such as AFWERX? Anybody want to take that?
Sure. So AFWERX is an Air Force program where they provide really very small amounts of money to startup companies. And it's actually, let me back up just a little bit. I think overall government support of sort of arm's length investment transactions is a tremendously positive development, because what it represents is patient capital. And that's really, really one of the problems that we have to address, particularly on the space hardware side. AFWERX is a very small program. There's also Defense Innovation Unit, which invests mostly in technology development. The CIA has InQtel that they've supported Silicon Valley firms for probably decades now. So there are kind of these US government agencies emerging that are supporting startups in the space arena, and that's a tremendously positive development. ESA has what seems to be a very promising program that I don't really know that many of the particulars, and perhaps somebody on the European side can talk about that when I wrap up. But the last point I want to make is there are a variety of technology development mechanisms with NASA, with the Department of Defense, some even with the Department of Energy, that I think can represent really effective ways of bootstrapping a firm in the early years. I mean, I think I'll go back to Bob's point. The first 5 years are really kind of critical to get more patient investment, and these things can represent a really positive step. Having said all of that, I think we need to do a much better job on from all of the governments of spacefaring nations in becoming more patient capitalists, because I see real problems of sort of the disparity of investments between applications, which can be very attractive short-term investments, and hardware, which is a really, really tough investment for a venture capital firm.
Can I jump into there relative to the finance side? Because you are absolutely right. The investment model that we have in technology on the Earth today does not work for space.
It doesn't. For space hardware.
Space hardware, and ultimately space services from the hardware.
Yeah.
The evolution of seed to angel and seed suck all basically the founder interest out, and then you go to VC. They don't want to build anything of scale. They want to build a demo. They want to make sure that you can hand the demo off, and then they flip it to someone else like PE to do the scale work. Everybody wants no risk, so they want the government involved, or Musk involved, or Bezos involved, or sovereign wealth funds out of Saudi Arabia. It does not work. There needs to be a new paradigm associated with how we do this, and it has to take into consideration the special economic challenges that you laid out with respect to hardware. Right. Hardware is going to be that's the sticky DNA that makes all this stuff work. Mm-hmm. And if you have to wait 3 years and finance your team through 3 years before you even get to a chance to be able to deploy it and make any money on it, it is a very difficult challenge. Unless you are a high net worth individual who has ability and access to capital that everybody else doesn't have. And if you really focus on lunar, my sense is that you're going to bootstrap your way into a variety of topics we've been discussing for the last hour. Government, public-private partnerships, They all bootstrap. At the end of it, you need an East India company, or you need somebody else who is saying, I'm doing it because I want to make money doing it. And the only way I think I can do that is I can basically create a special fund or series of funds that know the risk, can take the risk, and essentially can fund the risk in terms of the reward.
The risk, if I may add, that is indeed the biggest problem that any space startup faces. That is that the current venture capital industry just focuses on building the newest app. I mean, you look at a lot of venture capital funds that supposedly work with technology, and in the end, they just work with mobile applications. And I think a small anecdote to illustrate that: 3 years ago at Disrupt Space in Berlin, someone came on stage and said that, well, you know, what space needs is space Facebook, and whatever that means, right? Space Facebook right now is like if you would invest in Facebook when the internet was still DARPANET. It's completely not what the industry needs, and that's not the kind of risk profile that any reasonable space company can develop or accept. So that mindset in the venture capital world definitely needs to change if we want to have them have a role in the space industry and the space development.
Right. And I want to add to what Carlos says. I mean, again, to the creative part, right? I mean, I've been living in Silicon Valley for a number of years. Just moved to Switzerland, which is a whole different story. But, you know, having been around and on the ground, and Andy and I, Carlos, we looked at for example, the small launch market. I mean, it's crazy. You can't even count the small launch startups out there. The world doesn't need all of them. The world probably doesn't even need 10% of them. So it's just this hype, and that scares us a little bit, you know, that everybody's doing launchers now. That's kind of great because at least something's happening. But looking at it from an investor standpoint, we also risk a little bit that we overpromise and underdeliver, and then there comes this kind of anticlimax where people pump money into space, then they realize, and that's what we're worried about a little bit, they say, oh, well, that was my money lost, not too excited about space anymore. A little bit reminds me of the 80s where space station was hyped like crazy, like we're going to solve all the problems on planet Earth through a space station. So far, no no offense, we haven't solved any problems based on space station. No miracle drugs there, no nothing. So let's be very focused on coming up with creative solutions. But yeah, if it's a Facebook app or something, fantastic. As long as it doesn't involve mass, the better. But you know, be a little bit more, on the one hand, realistic, and on the other hand, creative, right? Very specific in terms of like immediate money-making things. And I remember there's what were they called? I think Orbit Fabric. No, some asteroid guys whose story I heard down in Silicon Valley who were talking about mining asteroids. And I was like, oh God, I mean, just give me a freaking break. Mining asteroids, commercial, this is nonsense. But it was a fantastic story because the story began with like, this is our long-term goal. Our short-term goal is we're developing a water thruster. And we're going to sell the water thruster to X, Y, and Z. And that's what we're going to have our initial commercial money. Down the road, we're going to use the water thruster for the asteroids. A bit out there. But it was a great first step where you heard from an investor point of view, these guys are not cuckoo. These guys are thinking about how to make the initial revenue. And I think that combination is the magic you need.
So maybe I want to throw something out there. I mean, I'm not sure if anybody has ever thought of this, but at least just came onto my mind that to make a successful lunar base and activities which is sustainable on the moon, most likely what we need is an industrial revolution type event like we had on Earth in many centuries ago and also recently, whereby putting some manufacturing facilities to build rockets and build satellites and build other things on the moon actually could sustain the moon activities, because from the moon you could basically go to Mars and other planets much more easier, and so on. So maybe activities which actually commercial activities which could actually use the moon as the base would likely be the right approach, most likely. Very much like an industrial revolution happened on Earth, in England and Western Europe 200 years ago. So, and then eventually in other countries after that. Without that, I don't believe, at least right now, the sustainability of a lunar base without having some kind of a activity that actually can sustain that. I know that we can go on for hours and hours to discuss this, and we are just a small group. There are other parties that actually should take place in this discussion. However, let me just ask the panelists. I'm not going to pick any more questions from the Q&A list, but if you see a question that you would like eagerly to answer, it's now your time. Otherwise, in less than 5 minutes, I would have to. Actually, in less than 2 minutes, I have to actually stop the webinar because I have a call in 2 minutes' time.
Then I wish everybody happy Thanksgiving.
Actually, before everybody just goes off, could you just smile on the screen? I'll take a screenshot and then I'll send it back to you. All right? It's the 3, 2, 1 now. 1 second, I had somebody a chat coming up. I have to delete that. Okay, right now. Excellent. I got the screenshot. So thank you very much to the registration people, to the participants. If you would like to attend, if you'd like to be in a panel in the future, I'm organizing one on IoT, machine-to-machine technologies. If you would like to be part of the panel, just send me an email. We'll actually organize a panel on application for small satellites, especially IoT, machine-to-machine, and other similar type applications and constellations. So please contact me if you would like to do a panel over the next couple of weeks. We'll organize that. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending. Thanks to the panelists. Bob is already left. I have to jump in another call. And I'm very sorry about Xavier Lobau couldn't make it. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny.
Stay safe.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.